She walked into the dealership wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt, where rows of million-dollar cars stood gleaming under lights, lined up along the walls. She slowly approached the counter and said, "Hi, I wanted to ask about the luxury McLaren parked outside." The salesman looked her up and down, one glance at her white t-shirt, another at her shoes. Then he chuckled a little and said in a mocking tone, "I think you're in the wrong place, ma'am." Then he gestured toward the exit while calling over two security guards and turned with sarcasm. "These cars start at $300,000. This isn't a sightseeing tour." Other staff members stifled laughter, nudging each other. Some customers turned to look as well. Her face flushed for a moment, but she didn't say a word. She turned quietly and walked out. But the next morning, something was going to happen that would change this salesman's entire career. The sun had barely risen when a shimmering Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled into the dealership's private lot. Morning lights spilled across the glass walls of Boston Luxury Motors, illuminating the showroom like a cathedral of opulence. The same staff who had chuckled yesterday now stood frozen, coffee cups suspended midair. The back door of the Phantom opened with a soft click. Out stepped the same woman from the day before, jeans, a crisp white tee, hair in a neat brown ponytail, face bare of makeup, but posture exuding a calm authority that silenced the room. She wasn't here to make a point, she was the point. Without a word, she walked past the reception desk. Blake Thompson, the senior sales manager, instinctively adjusted his navy blue suit and stepped forward, scanning her again, confused. She didn't belong, or so he still thought, but the junior salesman, Daniel, beat him to it. He approached her with polite professionalism, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Daniel. May I help you with anything specific today?" She smiled faintly and pointed upward. "Yes, I'm interested in the midnight blue coupe on the elevated platform." Blake's smile tightened. That car, the limited edition, Azure, wasn't just rare. It was exclusive. With only 15 units released worldwide and an 8-month waitlist, it was reserved for the elite. He stepped in. "Ma'am, perhaps I can show you something more suitable in our pre-owned division down the block." She looked at him, once, but her words were directed at Daniel. "Could you please walk me through the Azure's features?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at Blake. Blake cleared his throat. "That vehicle is appointment only and—" She reached into her pocket and handed Daniel a gold-embossed card. His eyebrows lifted. On it, Collins Foundation. Maggie Collins. Daniel swallowed. Everyone in Boston knew the name. The woman who just walked past their judgments was its founder. And her husband, Julian Collins, CEO of a major aerospace firm. The room fell utterly silent, and for the first time in years, Blake Thompson was speechless. Daniel straightened his back as he gestured toward the Azure, suddenly aware that this wasn't just a customer, this was someone who could change the trajectory of his career. "Right this way, Miss Collins," he said, his tone steadier than he felt. Maggie walked beside him, every step deliberate, her gaze scanning the vehicle with genuine interest. The midnight blue paint glistened under the recessed lighting, its curvature reflecting not just wealth but intention. The car wasn't a toy, it was an extension of power, crafted with precision for people who didn't need to prove anything. Daniel opened the passenger door with a soft click. Hand-stitched leather interior, custom Azure trims, V12 engine with... She raised a hand gently. "I've read the specs, I just wanted to see how it felt up close." Meanwhile, from the far end of the showroom, Blake stood frozen, watching the couple he had tried to usher away, now comfortably browsing one of the most coveted models in the country. Behind him, whispers began. Staff members nudged each other. A few pulled out phones to discreetly Google the Collins Foundation. Eyes widened. Blake's phone vibrated. A message from corporate. "Client name flagged VIP, Maggie Collins, treat with highest priority." His stomach dropped. Before he could act, a sleek man in a dark gray suit walked through the entrance. Early 40s, polished, decisive, he headed straight for Maggie. Julian Collins. He gave her a soft kiss on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late, love. Had to wrap up the call with Geneva." Maggie smiled, calm and radiant. "You're just in time." Blake nearly choked. The woman he'd dismissed yesterday wasn't someone's assistant, wasn't a PR stunt, wasn't a fluke. She was Boston elite, and she wasn't alone. The Collins couple now stood together beside the Azure. Wealth, grace, and influence in perfect sync. Daniel held the door as Maggie took a seat inside, adjusting the mirrors, absorbing the space like someone who'd already made the decision. Julian looked at Blake, his gaze sharp but unreadable. That look said it all. You saw clothes. I saw character. Julian placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. Thank you for treating my wife with professionalism, he said warmly. Daniel blinked, then nodded. It's my pleasure, sir. Blake, however, tried to salvage the moment. He stepped forward, his voice suddenly softer, almost apologetic. Miss Collins, Mr. Collins, I apologize for any misunderstanding yesterday. Had I known— Maggie looked up from the car interior. Her voice was calm, but each word landed with precision. Had you known what, Mr. Thompson? That I could afford it? That I wasn't here to take selfies? Blake swallowed hard. No, of course not. We get a lot of window shoppers. Julian raised an eyebrow. And do you usually dismiss them at the door, or only the ones wearing jeans? Silence fell again. A receptionist stopped typing mid-keystroke. Daniel, still holding the door, looked away. Maggie stepped out of the azure gracefully. We didn't come here for an apology, she said. We came for a decision. Julian pulled out a small black folder from his coat and handed it to Daniel. Inside, a pre-approved cashier's check. The amount written stunned even Daniel. Julian continued, We'll take the azure, delivery to our Beacon Hill address, and please ensure it's not driven a single mile before that. Blake's face turned pale. Certainly, Mr. Collins, right away. Maggie added, Also, Daniel gets full commission, not shared. Julian smiled. And perhaps some training modules for your senior staff. On judgment. The message was clear. Daniel nearly dropped the folder. Thank you, both of you. I don't know what to say. Maggie turned to him. Say you'll always treat the next person with the same respect, whether they walk in wearing Prada or Payless. Blake took a step back, his role suddenly insignificant in a place where grace, wealth, and humility had just walked hand in hand, and changed everything. As the Collinses left, the room stayed still. The phantom hummed quietly as the doors closed, and with it, so did a lesson no one in that dealership would forget. The Collinses stepped out of the dealership into the early afternoon sun, the glass doors reflecting their silhouettes as they paused on the stone steps. A valet pulled up in a matte black SUV, spotless, engine purring low. Julian opened the door for Maggie, but before she entered, she turned around and took one final glance through the glass. Blake was standing inside, watching, still stunned. Daniel remained behind him, eyes lowered but smiling, quietly victorious. Inside the car, Julian tapped a few commands into the center screen. Want to stop by the outreach center before dinner? Maggie nodded. I think we should. The kids were asking about you last time. He smiled. Then it's a promise. They drove off, the tires whispering over polished stone, leaving behind a dealership still trying to reset its equilibrium. Back inside, the whispers continued. That was Maggie Collins? The Maggie Collins? Blake slumped into his office, door closing behind him with a dull click. He dropped into his leather chair, hands on his head, then turned slowly toward the security monitors. Rewind, pause, play. There she was, walking in. White t-shirt, jeans, clean sneakers, not a hint of pretension. And he had tossed her out. He buried his face in his hands. Meanwhile, Daniel was still on the showroom floor, now surrounded by colleagues who'd ignored him the day before. A senior rep clapped him on the back. You just sold a phantom, full commission. Daniel didn't gloat. He simply nodded and whispered to himself, because I treated her like a person. That night, the Collins Foundation website saw a 3,000% spike in traffic. Local news outlets quietly began piecing together what had happened. But Maggie, she didn't say a word. She never needed to. Grace, after all, speaks loudest in silence. The next morning, the phone on Blake's desk rang before the sun was fully up. Mr. Thompson, came a clipped voice. This is Eleanor Grant from corporate. I need you in a video conference at 9 sharp. Blake rubbed his eyes. Yes, of course. May I ask what this is regarding? Just be prepared to explain why a multi-million-dollar client nearly walked out of our flagship store yesterday. The line went dead. He sat motionless for a long time, then stood and looked at the framed certificate on the wall. Employee of the Year, 2019. A knock sounded at his office door just before 9. Daniel stood there, suit freshly pressed, holding 2 coffees. One for you, he said, and one for the meeting. Blake took it wordlessly. In the conference room, the faces on the screen were not smiling. Eleanor folded her hands. Mr. Thompson, tell me, at what point during Maggie Collins' visit did you realize your mistake? He fumbled. I didn't recognize her. No, she said sharply, but you recognized her clothes. There was no defense. Daniel sat quietly beside him, not gloating, just witnessing. Eleanor continued, we've launched a retraining initiative. Daniel, you'll be co-leading it. Blake turned his head, startled. Him? She smiled coldly. He knew who the customer was without needing to know her name. The meeting ended. Blake felt the weight of 1,000 missed chances. Downstairs, Maggie and Julian were visiting the outreach center, where a dozen kids swarmed them with hugs. One boy, no more than 9, handed her a paper drawing of the azure, colored in crayon. She smiled and kissed his forehead. Perfect shade of blue. Julian took a photo from a distance. That'll make the perfect thank you card. Back at the dealership, Daniel sat alone at his desk. A young woman in simple clothes walked in, hesitated, then approached. I just have questions, she said. I'm not buying anything today. Daniel smiled. That's perfectly fine. Let's begin with what caught your eye. This time, the story would unfold differently. By the time the weekend rolled around, Boston Luxury Motors had undergone more than just a PR correction. It had a cultural reckoning. Daniel's story, and more so Maggie's quiet grace, had gone viral, not through flashy headlines, but through whispers of respect. An editorial in the Boston Globe read, sometimes the wealthiest people wear the plainest shirts and carry the deepest empathy. Maggie Collins reminded us of that. In a boardroom far away, Maggie sat across from the city's education commissioner. Her foundation had just secured approval to launch a mentorship program in public schools, pairing successful business leaders with children from marginalized communities. As the commissioner shook her hand, he said, I read about the dealership story. You could have embarrassed them. Instead, you inspired them. She smiled. Compassion scales better than shame. Meanwhile, Blake watched from the sidelines, his role now reduced, his pride slowly reshaped into reflection. One afternoon, as he walked through the showroom, he paused by the azure. A mother and daughter stood beside it, both in modest clothes. For a second, he hesitated, then he walked over. Let me know if you have questions, he said gently. The woman turned, surprised. Just looking. He nodded. That's how all great stories begin. Upstairs, Daniel was finalizing a training module titled Presence over Presentation. A quiet knock interrupted him. It was Blake. I'd like to help, he said simply. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then pulled out a second chair. Then let's start with listening. That night, Maggie stood on her balcony, looking out over the city. The skyline flickered with life. Beside her, Julian placed a hand on her shoulder. You didn't just buy a car this week, he said softly. You changed a lens. She smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to play the expected part. And beneath the city lights, change didn't scream. It simply stood still and shone. The following Monday, Boston Luxury Motors opened its doors under a different rhythm. On the floor, subtle changes had taken root, nothing announced, but everything felt new. The velvet ropes were lowered. A fresh tray of water bottles and snacks sat near the entry, with a small placard that read, All guests welcome. Daniel noticed it first and smiled. Blake, now dressed less like a gatekeeper and more like a guide, walked the floor with intention, pausing to acknowledge each visitor. A teenage boy in scruffy jeans lingered by the showroom's Bugatti. Blake approached. That one's built for vision, he said softly, not just speed. The boy lit up. I've read about it in magazines. Blake nodded. Ever driven a simulator? The teen shook his head. Blake tapped his earpiece. Daniel, fire up Bay 3. Moments later, the boy sat inside a full-scale digital cockpit. For 10 minutes, he wasn't just imagining the drive, he was in it. From the observation window, Maggie watched, unnoticed. She had returned unannounced, her eyes scanning the floor like someone revisiting the last chapter of a well-loved book. Julian whispered beside her, Want to say hi? She shook her head. They're writing their own story now. As they turned to leave, a young receptionist, new, perhaps nervous, called out gently, Excuse me, miss, do you need any help? Maggie turned, smiled, and simply replied, You already did. Outside, the city moved as always, but inside that glass showroom, the air held something lighter. The weight of judgment had lifted, and in its place was possibility. The kind you don't sell, the kind you live. The next week brought rain to Boston. Soft, misty sheets that made the skyline shimmer in gray hues. Inside her quiet home office, Maggie sat by the window, reviewing letters from students her foundation had helped. One read, "Dear Miss Collins, I didn't think people like me mattered until I saw what you built. Thank you for giving kids like me a shot." She folded the letter gently, her thumb tracing the edge before placing it into a small wooden box marked Proof. Julian Dulina. Downstairs, Julian prepared coffee. Moments later, the boy sat inside a full-scale digital cockpit. For 10 minutes, he wasn't just imagining the drive, he was in it. From the observation window, Maggie watched unnoticed. She had returned unannounced, her eyes scanning the floor like someone revisiting the last chapter of a well-loved book. Julian whispered beside her, "Want to say hi?" She shook her head. They're writing their own story now. As they turned to leave, a young receptionist, new, perhaps nervous, called out gently, "Excuse me, miss, do you need any help?" Maggie turned, smiled, and simply replied, "You already did." Outside, the city moved as always, but inside that glass showroom, the air held something lighter. The weight of judgment had lifted, and in its place was possibility, the kind you don't sell, the kind you live. The next week brought rain to Boston, soft, misty sheets that made the skyline shimmer in gray hues. Inside her quiet home office, Maggie sat by the window, reviewing letters from students her foundation had helped. One read, "Dear Miss Collins, I didn't think people like me mattered until I saw what you built. Thank you for giving kids like me a shot." She folded the letter gently, her thumb tracing the edge before placing it into a small wooden box marked Proof. Downstairs, Julian prepared coffee. "You still thinking about that dealership?" Maggie smiled faintly. "I'm thinking about what it means to show up when no one expects you to, and especially when they do." Across town, Daniel was now in charge of customer experience. Under his guidance, staff meetings had shifted focus, from conversions to conversations, from metrics to meaning. He wrote on the whiteboard in thick blue marker, "Perception isn't always reality, so let's meet people before we measure them." Blake sat in the front row, arms crossed, not in defiance anymore, but attention. The transformation was ongoing, but real. Later that day, a new customer walked in, an elderly woman with a walker. She scanned the floor wide-eyed. No one ignored her. No one suggested she visit another showroom. Instead, Blake approached with a chair in hand. "Take your time," he said. "We're not in a rush." From across the room, Daniel met his eyes. Both men smiled wordlessly. In the reflection of the dealership's glass, the city glowed under rainfall. And inside, something intangible glowed even brighter. Months later, Boston Luxury Motors hosted a private charity gala. Not in a ballroom, but in their own showroom. No tuxedos, no velvet ropes,